podcast for potential development by and with Uli Vogel. A warm welcome to everyone, dear listeners, to our podcast. And I'm always so happy to have such amazing guests. And once again, I've managed to bring a wonderful person here for our podcast. This is Frank Strathus, the co-founder and also managing director of the ILD from Berlin, the Institute for Leadership Dynamics, which has been around since 2011. And dear Frank, greetings to you. It's great to have you here with us, basically in the studio.
Thank you for the invitation. I'm really excited that I have the time today to chat with you, or that we can exchange ideas about what I hope will be some very exciting topics.
Yes, that's right. We actually have a lot of overlap there too. And yes, I'm really curious myself because you're involved in so many areas. A real expert in the field, but also someone you can have a great conversation with. It actually wasn't that long ago, just last autumn, that I was in Vienna, in Berlin with you guys. You gave me such a warm welcome, and you even took me on a half-city tour. So it was really, 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 really nice, and our listeners always like to know right at the start what they can expect. Of course, we want to briefly introduce you, Frank, so we know where you're from and where you're at right now. And then we'll dive into two hot topics. So, Snippet 2 is about future leadership. That's an area where you really know your stuff. You actually suggested it as a topic to me as well. I'm really passionate about it too, especially when you think about how wild the future is shaping up to be. So fast and interesting. And then, in the third snippet, in the third thumbnail, we'll also take a look at the topic of leadership evaluation. I have a particular approach to it, and you have your own as well. And it's becoming more and more important to actually evaluate leaders. So, what's really important there? Probably not just methods, but also attitude. So, I'm really curious to see how we'll bounce ideas off each other here and already. Let's jump right in, Frank, dear listeners, into Snippet 1. So, where does Frank Strathus actually come from? Originally, you started out in banking, then became a business graduate at the University of Berlin. You've completed a ton of additional training, including as a master conflict coach and master entrepreneur coach. You're strong in strategic leadership, including leading multicultural teams. That's something you've spent quite a bit of time on as well. You've held a whole range of HR roles in banking, at PwC, at Bombardier, but also as a consultant, and since 2011 at ILD. And that's how we met. I think it was at the start of the pandemic when we got together. But now, back to the whys, dear Frank. Choosing a career is always a first step, and there are all sorts of different answers to that. By chance, I've always wanted to, whatever it may be. But maybe that's something our listeners are really interested in. Why did you go into business, into banking? And then maybe after that, why HR as well, since that's been a constant for you?
Yeah, that's a good question. I still ask myself that from time to time. No, all jokes aside. The reason for going into banking was simply that it ran in the family. My father was. So, the first principle was, of course, that the son would do a banking apprenticeship, then he'd be standing on his own 2 feet, and after that, he could decide what he wanted to do in the future. That's how it was back then. I think things are a bit different these days. But back then, that's what triggered me, and to be honest, the bank didn't really captivate me either. So after that, I started my studies and got my degree in business administration, with a focus, ultimately, on human resources management. And that, in turn, was triggered by something else. Actually, it was during a walk with my father, who passed away some time ago, when he said, "We need a lot more and better HR people in the bank." And that walk, I can still picture it vividly in my mind today. It kind of triggered something in me, because I was really curious about what he meant by that. And, as was often the case with my father, it was a very lively conversation, and a lot of what we talked about still sticks with me today. And for that, I'm actually quite grateful to him because that influence really did come from my family, and that's what set me on this path. So, it wasn't a coincidence, but it was voluntary. There was never any pressure behind it, just an idea that kept growing and really took root.
But I actually find that interesting now, Frank, if I may interrupt, because your father basically spoke out of a sense of lack when it came to HR staff. So, he was obviously not satisfied with what the HR people were doing and thought it would be great if his son could help address that shortage. What kind of image did he have? That must have been quite a few years ago. Yeah, that was already
Quite a while.
ago. Tell us about it.
So, even back then, his view was already pretty clear that HR people just manage and administer things, that they don't really help him move forward in business, but that he actually needs people by his side who help shape things. And in that sense, he was maybe a bit ahead of his time. And I found that really interesting, too. So that's also a bit of what drives me, to shape things throughout my life, to take new paths. And not to give up at the first sign of resistance. I like challenges, I take them on, and I also like change, I tackle that, too. And honestly, I've been able to find all of that in the field of HR, which is such a broad, wide, and yet deep topic.
Yeah, so, you were in corporate, including with some really big players, so to speak, where you worked in HR. I only got to know you later, so here's a bit of a provocative question. How did you manage to cope with such a tight framework?
Yeah, good question. You know how it is, you try to push boundaries, and to do that, you first have to be part of the system so you have the acceptance needed to actually make those changes. And of course, I definitely ran into a few brick walls or got a bloody nose here and there. But that's just part of it, because that's where I learned the most for myself. That maybe you need to approach things differently, maybe not too impulsively, especially at the start of your career, when you come out of university thinking the world is yours and you know better. It's something you learn pretty quickly. How things really work. And that political engineering is just as much a part of HR as it is in business. And that you have to find your way in just the same, in order to shape things and make things happen.
I mean, honestly, political engineering can definitely help you out later on as well, especially if we take a look at the second half of your professional career, because, well, I personally know a lot of people who, so to speak, eventually switched sides and became successful entrepreneurs. But that probably helped you as well, this political engineering, later on, maybe even to win clients where things are a bit bigger and more complex. But maybe you can explain it to us, because that step is quite a special one, to say, okay, now, without a safety net, I'm starting out as an entrepreneur and founding an institute.
Yeah, that definitely wasn't easy. So, when my co-partner, co-founder, Stefan Skonholz, my boss at the time at Bombardier, in the global role I was also in, said he would voluntarily leave the company after his third term as labor director, because after duty comes the freestyle. And he actually wanted to travel the world in his motorhome. At first, I didn't really believe it, but then I realized who was in the running as his successor. And then, by chance, we ended up in the US and got trained there. On the topic that's become a bit of the DNA of ILD, namely, conflict competence and crisis intervention, by one of the so-called conflict gurus of the US. So there we were, sitting in the US, and we said, why don't we just start our own company? Well, we did it. He was basically already out. I was quickly on my way out too, and we left on our own terms. And then we actually ended up subletting a tiny office on the Cutum. And all we had was the idea to do something with conflict. And from that, a small boutique has now emerged, which has much more power, in quotation marks, Not just conflict, but whose DNA is still all about it. The topic of conflict is, of course. So, it's kind of a crazy story. And, on the other hand, I wouldn't want to miss it for anything. I'm probably burned out now, too, at least when it comes to working for a corporation.
Definitely. Yeah, it was pretty much the same for me, of course. I realized pretty quickly, oh, this freedom. It just tastes too good to ever really want to go back. And that maybe brings me right to our second snippet, which is all connected to the ILD, so to speak, in terms of the topic, future leadership. And you just mentioned that, in the end, it all actually started with conflict, so to speak. That's how you could trace it back, what the original reason was. And here we are now. We're not conflict specialists here in the profiling values community, nor are other interested listeners. In our preliminary talk, we looked at harmony and conflict. Those are typical areas of tension. If you start right at the beginning and explain this area of tension between harmony and conflict to people, could you share a few basics with us?
I'm not sure if I can really give your very competent community that many basics, but at least I can share what my experience has been. And my experience, both from the active roles I was able to take on as a top executive and now from the consulting side, is that in many organizations, there's an artificially maintained harmony. And this leads to, naturally, people avoid conflicts and then aren't really able to manage them competently. And the issues just keep simmering and eventually flare up again here or there. And the environment is surprised, and the people involved in the conflict are even more so. So, this artificial harmony in organizations really has to be described as a cultural element. Of course, that's exactly what we need to break up more and more these days. We're losing our innovative strength. We're losing good people. We can't attract good people. We're dealing with all these mega trends, from agility to digitalization to artificial intelligence, all the way to the demographic situation in Germany, which is a huge concern for us, or really for everyone. It's a massive concern for organizations. And above all, something we shouldn't forget is that nowadays, there are basically 4 generations working within organizations. With completely different values, with completely different ideas. What actually defines leadership? What defines collaboration? How do I want to be led? How do I lead myself? Or how do I manage and handle conflicts? These are all areas, of course, where very different generations really come together. Although, Uli, to be honest, I'm not really a fan of these generational boxes because I think we have our bell curve in every generation. Normal distribution. We have absolute top people there who deliver results, who are innovative, who want to shape things. And of course, we also have the other side, which we see in every generation, people who want more free time, who want to structure their lives differently, which is totally fine. But that also means something for HR. A move away from collectivism towards individual treatment, as they say, so towards individualized treatment of the strengths and potential that are ultimately there. And by the way, our profiling tools are really helpful with that.
Yeah, and to actually plan and follow this individual development path as well. I really like the term you used, artificial harmony. It's very, very good. But you can probably do that for different reasons. We had a team meeting today, and we also did a team analysis a few months ago. We picked up on that again. For us, the harmony is probably kept so high because we really have such good, well, we're a really small team, very personal relationships. And when you really like each other so much, maybe you don't like to bring up uncomfortable things. But then there's also artificial harmony, as you mentioned, I think. That's what you meant. In that case, it's more about, well, I have to be careful here, I'd rather sweep it under the rug, because it could end up hurting me politically. And then at some point, you end up with these, yeah, maybe even volcanic outbursts if you let it go on for too long, letting it smolder. But there's also Reinhard Sprenger, who wrote a book about this topic. I don't know what you think of him, he's definitely a controversial figure. I think it's called The Magic of Conflict, if I remember correctly, and what he says at this point is, yeah, it's not about solving the conflict itself is the solution. So he turns it right around. And now I'm curious, you've described harmony, but what about when we talk about conflict? You're a specialist, an expert, trained by the best of the best. So what are the typical types of conflicts we're seeing right now, especially when we talk about future leadership? And what kind of interpersonal dynamics are behind them? You told me earlier that you just came from a crisis intervention. You're probably constantly on the go. Maybe you could share a few inside stories with us.
Well, let's put it this way. Types of conflicts range from conflicts of interest to resource conflicts and so on. We all know about these, there are plenty of them. But fundamentally, and I found this really fascinating when I was trained in the US all the way up to my master's degree. One thing became pretty clear through the scientific analyses that have been carried out over decades in the methodology I represent, among others. It's fairly obvious that about 70% of workplace conflicts aren't actually about facts or expertise, but are relationship-oriented. If that's really the case, and I can only confirm it from my own personal experience, then everything we still see in some traditional conflict trainings or in classic conflict theory, namely attempts to argue factually and professionally and to come up with a quick, initial compromise, will only lead to a result in about 30% of cases, at best. Whether that's actually sustainable is still a big question. So, in plain German, it's important to address the relationship, yes, and to look at what's actually going wrong in the relationship. And how can I first bring the relationship back to, let's say, a neutral level, so that a different way of dealing with the conflict in the other party becomes possible. By the way, I really like to use the term conflict partner because, to me, that's not an opponent. It's a partner with whom I'm trying to argue and wrestle for the best solution that can come out of a conflict. And I think the approach that Mr. Sprenger brought up is something I can absolutely relate to. Conflict is the solution because it drives innovation forward if conflicts are managed constructively. And for that, you have to understand how they work. And for that, you need to know what influence emotions, both your own and those of the other person, have on the situation. I need to know how emotions affect behavior. And when I understand these laws, when I've really understood the underlying principles in conflicts, then I can approach interpersonal relationships and the relational level in a completely different way. And of course, that's quite an art, especially when we don't have our emotions under control and they're simmering just below the surface. In that case, nothing works at all at first. But there are specific tools and essential skills that can help you return once again to a more positive and highly constructive approach.
So, in that sense, the usual first piece of advice, always stay objective whenever communication gets difficult, is actually counterproductive. We actually need to move to a completely different level, if I interpret it that way. But I am curious, what kind of things are there? Well, without you having to share all your expertise, of course. Because when I get really worked up, it's not that easy to calm me down. So, what is there? Like, what?
Well, the method, he says, is to delay your response. So, it's called delay responding in the original, meaning you don't immediately respond to your conflict partner's provocation, but actually step out of the situation. First, just leave the room. And I can do that by really trying to address and express how I'm feeling in that moment, so, verbalizing emotions, as we call it, or expressing emotion. That means going in and saying, look, I can feel things are boiling up inside me, or I'm annoyed, or I'm disappointed, or maybe I'm angry, or I'm irritated, which might be a gentler way to put it, so that I can really step out of the situation for a moment and give myself a chance. First, manage your own emotions, and then try a new approach. And then, of course, by really reaching out to the other person and making it clear why the person is important to you and why resolving the situation matters to you. And I can only do all of this by using I statements. If I'm always pointing the finger at others, that will only make things escalate. But if I express how I'm feeling right now and why something is important to me, then I think I have a good chance, let's say, in conflict situations. By managing my emotions, I can approach things differently. Yeah.
So, you just mentioned I statements. Back in my first leadership training role, that's what they called it. Still the three-part I statements, there are different models behind this. But as you nicely put it, it's about conveying how you're feeling overall. And that really means everything, but especially making sure the emotions are included. And then comes the next point. To communicate the connecting element. I think it's really, really important to get across that you need the other person, your conflict partner, and that finding a solution matters. I believe those are big bridges that can be built. And yeah, if you look at it today, we've put it under future leadership, this key competency, conflict competence. What role does it play among all the other competencies we have in leadership and in cross-functional collaboration today? Can its importance even be overestimated?
That's a good question, but maybe let me go back a bit before I answer it, because there's something else that's important to me. We have neurological research that has given us a lot of information over the past decades or years. And from that, we know that there's no such thing as decision-making or thinking without emotions. So we know very clearly that emotions play a completely different role today than they did 10 or 20 years ago, or whenever. That means what's still anchored in the minds of many in management or what's still sometimes stuck in the heads of leaders, that emotions are unprofessional, is simply not true. Dealing with emotions, using emotions, that's actually very professional. You just have to do it constructively. I think that's the big connection to the topic of leadership. And you just explained that really, really well. So, why is conflict suddenly such a hot topic? So, I analyzed several studies last year for a large corporation where I gave a 2-hour talk at the HR Summit, whether it was from the big players like PwC, my old company, or KPMG, Ernst & Young, McKinsey, Boston Consulting, and all the others, you name it. There have been a lot of studies in recent years on the topic of conflict and the impact of conflict. The Americans were already onto this in the mid-90s, early 2000s, and had recognized this topic. Now it's starting to spill over here a bit. So, conflict competence in the US and in the American context is considered the key skill for collaboration and leadership. Of course, that's something you can debate. But it is definitely a very important skill. This becomes especially clear in cross-functional collaboration, but also in leadership. The more conflict competent I act, the better I can, for example, manage transformations. Transformations always have something to do with resistance. People feel insecure, they don't know what's going to happen to them. What emotions are being stirred up? Will I still have a secure job? Will my boss stay? Will I stay in my role? Do I still have any influence? That means a lot of uncertainty. And with that, you automatically have to deal with a lot of resistance. And dealing with resistance is nothing other than managing conflicts. Managing them. And you can already see, or as we said earlier, the 4 generations. How much potential for conflict do we have everywhere? By now, especially with huge challenges like AI or digitalization. There's massive potential for conflict everywhere. And that's why I think it's important nowadays to pay attention to the topic of conflict competence.
I also believe that the ever-quickening pace of things plays a role here as well. You just mentioned a few points: AI, the different generations, and so on. But the thing is, human progress feels almost exponential. And maybe, in the end, it actually is. And then, when it's applied well, that's a good thing. On the one hand, it might be a catalyst. But on the other hand, as you said earlier, it can also be a source of creativity. And that's why maybe we should rather see conflict, not that everyone has to embrace it, but we should definitely see it as extremely useful, not something to be avoided. Because if we do that, we cut ourselves off from a lot of things, or rather, we won't be able to handle things anymore. Those were really great insights, Frank, that you shared with us here. Should we switch over to leadership evaluation now? Because I think both of us have experience with different setups and methods. You've been doing it for a really long time. Would you like to give a bit of an intro? Your experience in leadership assessment spans decades. And maybe, what do you focus on and what do you see as most important there?
So I think, when it comes to leadership evaluation as a whole, the main thing is to get clear on what I actually want as a company, or as the person using such a tool or process. Do I want to diagnose certain technical topics? For that, maybe a technical interview is enough. So there I want to look at personalities. I want to know whether the person's skills and experience fit what the role requires or what the team needs. Or the cultural match, which I think is becoming more and more important these days. It's becoming increasingly important. My attitude is that the first thing that matters is what I want. You can misuse any assessment center. You can basically misuse any profiling for topics it wasn't actually intended for. And that's why, at the beginning, it's always, what is my goal, what effect do I want to achieve with it, and what is my attitude towards it? That's the first thing to assess. From the experiences that I have had, I have to be honest, I've personally gone through quite a few in my life. Assessment centers, as a participant. But even during my studies, I developed assessment center elements for a major management consulting firm because AC was one of my favorite topics. I even wrote a thesis on it, so the topic has followed me from partner ACs. At PwC all the way to Bombardier, or now in consulting, where we run a lot of development centers for our clients. It is absolutely essential to ensure that it is a meticulously researched and thoroughly developed subject matter, a comprehensive process that is extensively coordinated with every single stakeholder and team member involved, and one that is specifically and uniquely tailored to meet the precise requirements and diverse needs of the situation at hand. We don't conduct a single evaluation without profiling. And the profiling value concept is an absolutely suitable foundation to build on. And the personality, the values, orientations, combinations with the job, especially in recruiting, really, congratulations again at this point. What you've developed is really very robust, very substantial. And if, alongside this personality, values, and job analysis, I'll try to keep it short now, you also take the step and say, I'll combine this with individual profiling methods where I look at key competencies, like communication or competence, for example. Then you already have a wonderful foundation, which you can use in addition to what you gather from role simulations, fact-finding exercises, or whatever else you include, as well as interviews, as an additional source of information. But this foundation also has substance and isn't so heavily dependent on individual subjective perceptions, which inevitably always play a role in these processes. Assessment centers and the like always have that element. There are observers sitting there who are briefed and experienced, but we can't and don't even want to completely turn off our subjectivity, because gut feeling is still important, no matter what method we use.
Yeah, I like that. My very first trainer in consulting, whom I really value and who helped me move forward a lot, he always said, when it comes to personnel selection, never make a decision based solely on your gut feeling. But also, never go against your gut. And he also had some great sayings, like, well, you can spot the high flyers and the totally incompetent ones right away. So, you really have to dig a bit deeper and see how you can actually make a valid decision there. What do you do? And now, I come more from the individual assessment side of things. Of course, you learn that too. You always have someone sitting in with you, and in large assessments, there's always a second person as well, but you're more from the assessment center side, where the role plays and exercises are really, really clear, and there are also quite a few observers. How do you see the way assessment centers have developed over the past few years? I keep hearing that it's not given as much importance anymore because it's expensive and it's not easy to get people there. But you just told me recently that you spent another whole week there. Really busy, that's impressive. How do you see the development of assessment centers?
I think the classic assessment center has had its day. For the simple reason that it really is very labor-intensive and expensive, and it always depends heavily on the quality of the observation and the care taken in selecting the tools, as well as the relevance to competencies and situations. You could go on and on about this. I think it's absolutely right for some areas, but in our company, we don't do it in the classic way either. That's why we call it leadership evaluation. We've built a process that consists of several elements, including the profiling we've mentioned. But it also includes individual assessment center elements, which we put together as needed, all the way to robust, semi-structured biographical interviews and so on. So, the goal is to get a really well-rounded picture of the person. But ultimately, it's just as important that the person, especially during recruiting, also gets a good impression of the company and those who. So, it's no longer a one-way street, but nowadays it's a multi-track approach. And what's really trending now is not just the selection aspect, but essentially the development aspect, the focus on development. So even when I bring people on board, if I decide to hire them, from day one they should already have a development plan in hand based on what we've discovered, and they receive this through the profiling results, even during recruiting. They get something to take home for themselves, even if they're not selected, something that might help them move forward. So it's really an added value for everyone involved, whether they invest a day, half a day, or 2 days and put in the effort. I think it's more diverse, it's more individualized, and it's definitely more development-oriented than it used to be. And above all, for me, it's essential to do this with respect and appreciation. That's the be-all and end-all for me when carrying out such procedures. Because we're all different, and that's what a good team thrives on, our differences. So, in that sense, respect and appreciation are, I believe, absolutely essential these days. Yeah.
And I'm glad that my trainer, even 25 years ago, really emphasized this and said, folks, this is about meeting people at eye level. That's super important. Otherwise, people get the feeling that they have to bear themselves completely. That's counterproductive, it doesn't help at all. So we really need to value these differences as well. Exactly. And you nicely mentioned how you pick out individual things, that's the most important part. So, in the past, maybe it was just, let's say, a single tool, and today it's a nice, diversified toolbox where you can pull out a bit of this and that. Using this method here and that feeling there, it's really important to bring that into development. I always say that a good assessment during hiring should really already be, so to speak, top onboarding and basically the first development plan right away. And that's exactly the point where, as you rightly said, everyone truly benefits. And I always say it the other way around too, if we don't take a close look and just hire someone after a cup of coffee and a short interview. And then after 6 months, the employee asks us, or they say, well, this really isn't a good fit at all. Couldn't you have maybe put in a bit more effort? You did have the insight, after all, and I think that's where we. It's also a very, very important job that we commit ourselves to using the tools available to us in the best possible configuration, with an eye on natural fit, but also on development. And then to do that to the best of our knowledge and conscience.
Yes, absolutely. And what you also have to say, because I think everyone who works with people, in coaching or in HR, and so on, they have a knack for it, and they also have the spirit, the mindset, and the right attitude for it. But especially with colleagues on the management level who think in business terms, it's important to make it clear to them what the business facts are, what a bad hire actually costs, and what it costs to fill a position anew. And there are some fantastic, completely new analyses, for example from KPMG, a study that's quite far-reaching about what kinds of conflict costs actually exist. And there's really not much more you can say about it. So, there are also tools from the Americans, from our colleagues, from our strategic partner. In Florida, there's a cost calculator for conflict cultures and conflict situations. And when you look at that, those are amounts you just wouldn't believe.
And when?
It comes to indirect and direct costs. But it's the same thing. When it comes to assessment centers, evaluations, or whatever else. When we look at people, yeah, you just have to see what happens with bad hires. That's pretty self-explanatory, I think.
Yeah, absolutely. We've now also developed a bad hire cost calculator, which will soon be available on our website. Those are just the business-related costs, but if you consider the other, let's call them collateral damages. If you also look at those, not to mention the strategic, let's say, time losses that occur, you really can't invest too much when it comes to hiring.
Absolutely, absolutely. So every profiling, I really have to say this, and I'm only turning 62 this year, so every profiling, every properly designed assessment brings way more benefit than it costs. Yeah.
Absolutely. And at this point, I also want to recommend your conflict tool, which you showed me last year, right? I got to try it out, and I found it really, really impressive. So, in that sense, just a quick mention here. A recommendation for Frank Strathus from ILD, the Institute for Leadership Dynamics. They have great stuff, they have great tools, they're really doing a fantastic job. And we're in a good partnership with them. That's also why we're talking today. Well, we talked today, Frank, because time's pretty much up. I don't think there's anything more to add. It was absolutely wonderful having you here. Thank you so much for your valuable time.
Always a pleasure, dear Uli. And thank you as well for your trust in the collaboration. And what we keep sharing with each other is truly a joy for me. And I'm not just saying that because others might be listening, it's something I genuinely feel. And I hope for more of that, my friend.
That's exactly what we'll do. So, thank you. See you soon. Bye-bye.
Bye.